When the HOA tried to illegally sell 600 acres of untouched land, they didn't realize it belonged to the last Winslow, the silent owner of every contract they ever filed. The board broke ground on legacy soil, unaware the county itself was already spoken for. And now the rules are about to be rewritten, one signature at a time. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. When I moved back to Laurel Hill, nobody really noticed. I was the lady in the gray truck with the dented bumper, unloading planters and birdseed at dusk. I wore wide-brimmed hats, not for style, but because the sun hurt a little more these days. My hands were usually dirty from soil, and my smile, well, it didn't come easy anymore. Not since James died. We used to dream about moving here after retirement. He'd fish. I'd finally start that herb garden I always talked about. Instead, cancer stole the calendar, and after the funeral, when the house in Charleston felt too quiet, I did something nobody expected. I packed up and left. Not for escape. For roots. Laurel Hill was my father's town, long before it became a pin on someone's real estate map. Back then, it was pecan trees and porch swings, not vinyl fencing and HOA newsletters. But still, there was something in the air, that slow, humming stillness I remembered from childhood. I needed that, desperately. The house I bought wasn't anything special, just a single-story colonial tucked at the edge of a new development called the Willows at Maple Run. Fresh pavement, bland signage, and neighbors who waved out of politeness, not familiarity. The kind of place where every mailbox looked the same and a wind chime could trigger a warning letter. But I didn't mind. I wasn't here to make waves, just plant lavender and remember how to breathe. They called me Mrs. Avery, James' last name, the one I used on the mortgage. It felt safer in a way. Simpler. Nobody questioned it. To them, I was just another older widow trying to stretch out a pension and stay busy. Harmless, forgettable. But I kept to myself not out of weakness, out of intention. See, there are advantages to being overlooked. People speak freely around you. They underestimate you. And when they think you don't matter, they show you who they really are. The first sign of change came when I drove past the old Winslow Trail, a narrow, winding path that used to cut through my father's land. We walked it every spring when the dogwoods bloomed, but now it was gated, paved, and renamed Maple Run Fitness Loop. I pulled over, got out, and just stared. That land, it meant something. My father was never the kind of man to hang diplomas on walls, but he framed maps. Survey maps, deed sketches, hand-drawn plats. He'd roll them out like they were gospel, and he'd say, "Oh, Catherine, don't ever let them confuse ownership with occupation." Those words stayed with me. Back in my garage, tucked inside a cedar chest wrapped in oilcloth and mothballs, I kept them. Those same survey maps. Marked with charcoal, labeled in his pen. Some dated over 100 years back when Winslow's owned nearly half the county, piece by piece. Most people forgot that, or maybe they just never knew. But I hadn't forgotten. I didn't come here to start trouble. I didn't come here to reclaim a legacy. I came here to grieve. But when a man with a clipboard knocked on my door 2 weeks later, talking about development expansion zones and adjusted community assessments, something in me stirred. Something old, something fierce. They didn't know who I was, but they would. Trevor Maddox showed up with a clipboard and the kind of smile that always hides a threat. I was watering my rosemary when he strutted up the driveway, patent leather shoes glinting under the sun, one hand casually tucked into his salmon-colored slacks. He had that voice, polished, patronizing, used to being listened to. "Mrs. Avery," he said like he was already bored. "Just a heads up, we'll be doing some lot adjustments this week. Some minor development upgrades, standard expansion procedures." I paused mid-spray. "What kind of upgrades?" "Oh, you know." He waved his hand as if it didn't matter. "New perimeter fencing, a dog park, maybe a splash pad if the budget allows. Phase 3 is ahead of schedule, so we're opening up Section 47C for early bids." That name hit me like a dropped stone. I smiled politely, though something in me twisted. "Section 47C?" He checked his clipboard. "Yes, ma'am. Old tract. Not currently in HOA jurisdiction. We're finalizing annexation this month. Shouldn't affect your parcel directly, but you'll get the updated bylaws in the mail. Just sign and return." I nodded, but I was no longer listening to him. My heart had started thudding in my ears. 47 degrees Celsius. That was more than a lot number. That was the heartbeat, my father's name for the stretch of land just behind the ridge, where the pines ran thicker and the soil turned rich and red. He said it pulsed with memory, a place where roots remembered who planted them. We'd hike it every summer, tracing property lines and boundary stones, making up legends about each curve of the land. And now this man in pastel golf shirts, was telling me they were going to sell it off like a slice of pie? That evening, I took the old trailhead from behind my property. I hadn't walked it in years. The grass was patchy, and a no trespassing HOA construction zone sign hung where the old wooden Winslow marker used to be. I pushed past it anyway. My boots sank into familiar dirt. Halfway up the ridge, I found it, the stone. It used to sit upright, carved with our initials in the year, WLW 1902. My great-grandfather's mark, a century-old proof of ownership. Now it was cracked, pushed sideways into a trench by a backhoe like trash. I stood over it, my hand brushing its rough face. They thought it was debris. They didn't know what they were erasing. A few days later, a formal notice came in the mail, glossy and full of arrogance. Dear resident, pursuant to Section 8.7 of the Maple Run Expansion Charter, the HOA will finalize the sale of land designated as Section 47C to Strathmore Private Developments. Enclosed, you will find revised community assessments and deeded access routes for future construction vehicles. Compliance is mandatory. It ended with the usual. We appreciate your cooperation as we continue to build a better community. I remember standing there, that letter shaking in my hand, thinking, they don't even know what they're selling. Because I do. That land has never been on the market. It was part of the Winslow Trust, a legal remnant from before zoning laws, before HOAs, before this town even had a mayor. It was never subdivided, never transferred. My father used to say, "It's not land, Katie. It's a promise." And now they wanted to rip it open for a dog park? I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just started digging. Not in the ground, not yet, but in boxes, in archives, in attics. I pulled out maps wrapped in wax paper, deeds with wax seals, letters from county clerks with trembling ink. Some of the documents were older than the HOA president himself. They weren't just trying to bulldoze trees. They were trying to erase me. My name, my bloodline, my roots. I could feel something coiling inside me. Not rage. Not yet. Something deeper. Something like awakening. Trevor and his committee didn't know it, but they hadn't just pushed a fence onto my land. They had crossed a line drawn in ink, sweat, and inheritance. They had touched the heartbeat. It was the smell that brought it all back. Cedar and old paper, dust and ink, the kind that clings to forgotten pages and memories too heavy to throw away. The farmhouse had been sitting empty for 5 years now. After Daddy passed and Mama moved to assisted living, I couldn't bring myself to open the place. It was boarded up, sealed tight against time. But the moment I saw that fence line cut across the ridge, I knew exactly where I had to go. The front door stuck, as if it didn't want to remember me. The inside was just as I left it, crocheted curtains sagging in the corners, a cracked photo of my father in uniform on the mantel, and on the side table near his old recliner, the thick, black King James Bible he always kept close. The spine was worn smooth by calloused fingers and Sunday mornings. I sat down and opened it. Tucked between Psalms and Proverbs was a folded parchment, its edges soft with age, sealed with red wax, still unbroken. I held my breath as I cracked it open. The air shifted, like something ancient had exhaled. It was all there. Let it be recorded that on this 18th day of October, 1902, the land known as Laurel Holdings, measuring 600 acres from Winslow Creek westward to Harrow Ridge, shall remain in trust to the legal descendants of William L. Winslow in perpetuity. Signed, notarized, hand-stamped by a long-defunct county office. I sat back and stared. 600 acres. That wasn't just the trail or the ridge. That was everything, the entire development, from the clubhouse to the tennis courts, from the splash pad to the so-called future dog park. They had built an entire HOA empire on my family's land, and they had no idea. I spent the next few days in a fog of deliberate motion. I laid the old map out across my kitchen table, matched every marker with modern GPS coordinates, used old tax ledgers to cross-check parcel boundaries. The land had been quietly passed down, generation to generation, with taxes prepaid through my grandfather's old trust account. The problem was none of it had been uploaded into the county's modern database. Not because it wasn't legal, it just wasn't digitized. That made it invisible to people like Trevor and his kind. They built their paper castle on a ghost foundation. But I was the ghost. I contacted an old friend of James's, a property law consultant out of Atlanta, and sent over scans of everything. He called me 2 hours later, stunned silent. "Catherine," he said, "this deed is airtight. And if what you're saying about the HOA land is true, then they've developed on your property without a valid lease or easement. That's grounds for legal reclamation." I said nothing, but my fingers found the edge of the deed again, like I needed to be sure it was still real. Then came the second surprise. While scanning the HOA bylaws, buried in their 48-page PDF packet they so graciously sent homeowners every year, I found something curious. A clause under Section 11.3 likely drafted to prevent outside interference. In the event a non-residential landholder claims legal title to property within HOA jurisdiction and submits a Class B ownership certification, that land shall be considered non-voting and exempt from dues, restrictions, and board governance. My eyes froze on the words non-voting. They'd meant it to keep developers out. But if I filed that ownership claim, the entire HOA board, including Trevor's precious presidency, would lose voting authority over every square inch of land built on Winslow soil. They could host their meetings in the clubhouse, sure, but they'd be voting on air. I looked down at the old Bible, at the trembling signature of my great-grandfather, and something clicked. This wasn't just land. This was leverage. They thought they owned power because they controlled rules and fines and fences. But real power doesn't knock. It waits. And when the moment's right, it opens the Bible and rewrites everything. Some wars are fought in silence. I didn't march into the HOA office waving deeds or demand headlines. That would have given them time to circle wagons, twist narratives. I'd learned something from James. Mergers weren't about brute force. They were about timing, pressure points, and patience. And paper, always paper. James used to say, "Control the flow of information, and you control the game." God, I missed him, but I remembered. While Trevor and his committee planned splash pads and sidewalk art, I drove 2 counties over to meet a man named Bill Farnsworth, a former colleague of James, now quietly consulting for clients who preferred discretion. Within 2 weeks, I had what I needed: a trust set up in Delaware, 3 shell LLCs with no digital footprints, and 1 controlling stake in Laurel County's title and deed office, which, as luck would have it, was desperately underfunded and 3 years behind on digitizing records. A modest investment, one James would have called pocket leverage. The director, a sweet woman named Carla, who had been using Windows 7 until last year, was more than happy to accept a donation from the Winslow Historic Land Preservation Trust. I paid for new scanners, hired 2 retired archivists, and quietly introduced a quality assurance system that required every land transaction to be cross-verified through the Historic Archive, which I now managed. No press releases, no public board meetings, just a few checks, a few coffees, and a digital infrastructure that now funneled every sale, every lien, and every rezoning request through me. And suddenly, Trevor's B-expansion project hit a snag. It started with an email. "Ms. Avery, we've encountered a delay in processing the buyer's deed request for Section 47C. The system flagged a conflicting ownership pattern dating back to 1902. Please advise." I advised. I sent a formal request for documentation, original plats, surveyor affidavits, and annexation proof. Trevor, naturally, couldn't produce any of it, because it didn't exist. All they had were assumptions and arrogance. 3 days later, the buyer pulled out. Uncomfortable with title ambiguity, their lawyer said. Needs clarification before proceeding. Translation: they smelled smoke and ran before it caught fire. And just like that, the sale stalled. Trevor looked like a man trying to light wet matches. But I didn't stop there. I fed the system slow, 1 parcel at a time, each flagged as pending verification, each connected to a record in my grandfather's archive. By the end of the month, 62% of the HOA's developed land was officially under historical review, and not one of them knew I was behind it. At night, I'd sit at my dining table, the original deed resting beside me, wrapped now in a strip of red ribbon, one my mother used to tie around birthday gifts when I was little. I hadn't meant for it to become a symbol, but every time I looped that ribbon, I felt anchored, rooted, like I wasn't doing this alone. Because I wasn't. Not really. My father never trusted paper pushers. He'd keep multiple copies of every deed, signed in triplicate, one in the bank, one in the Bible, and one under the floorboard of his study. He said, "They'll always come for what's yours if they think you're too polite to stop them." He wasn't wrong. I could feel him now, not as a memory, but as momentum. Every scan I oversaw, every title I re-verified, every smirk I imagined Trevor losing, one unanswered email at a time. Control didn't come from shouting. It came from knowing what they didn't, holding what they needed, and watching while they stumbled through shadows, unaware the floor beneath them wasn't theirs. Not anymore. The first fine arrived folded in half, sealed with an embossed HOA sticker like it was a wedding invitation. Inside, notice of violation, unauthorized flora, section 12B. Non-regulation vegetation planted within community common borderlines. Fine. $250. It was about the rosemary. The same rosemary I'd been watering when Trevor came up my driveway weeks ago. The same rosemary my mother planted outside her kitchen window in 1963. The notice was laughable, petty, but it was also deliberate. Over the next week, 3 more arrived. Noise pollution. Excessive chime sounds violating community peace ordinances. Unregistered irrigation. Unauthorized drip line connected to shared runoff infrastructure. Exterior aesthetic conflict. Unapproved vintage garden sculpture. Stone bird bath. Total, $1,200. I didn't argue. I didn't respond. Instead, I did what any polite Southern woman does when the church ladies whisper behind her back. I smiled sweetly and sharpened my knives behind closed doors. First, I started cataloging. Every envelope, every timestamp, every arbitrary infraction was photographed under direct lighting with a digital timestamp and uploaded into a personal folder labeled Community Harassment Phase 1. I began noting patterns, days of delivery, time of day, type of violation. I documented the fact that the notices were hand-delivered when one slipped in after midnight, which under Laurel County's revised notification law, Section 9.4, 2020, made them inadmissible as formal service. Trevor, of course, never thought to check that. Then I forwarded every file to the County Land Use Auditor's office. A new department, newly funded, newly staffed, and, as fate would have it, newly directed by a woman I helped appoint during last year's municipal restructuring, Nadine Ellis, a former zoning attorney and very fond of fresh starts. Nadine and I had lunch once a month. She preferred sweet tea over wine, but she had a mind like a bear trap. When she saw the first round of fines, she simply said, "Interesting. Let them keep going." So I did. I stayed silent, said nothing, paid nothing, let them pile their paperwork high. What they didn't realize was that I wanted them to escalate. Trevor, being exactly the kind of man who mistakes silence for surrender, started to crow. I'd see him standing with his clipboard on the sidewalk across from my house, arms folded, making little notes while watching the wind move my chime. That wind chime, the one they hated so much, had hung in my family since the early 1950s. My father made it himself from melted pieces of the original Laurel Hill church bell after it collapsed in a storm. He had salvaged it, preserved the sound that once called generations to worship, and hung it on our porch so the spirit could keep ringing. They thought it was tacky. They thought it was loud. They fined me for it. They didn't realize they were trying to silence their own history. Each clang of that chime was the town's past, reminding them who built these streets, who owned the ground beneath their HOA badges and polished signs. The real irony? According to the original founding charter of Laurel Hill, the one archived in the historic records I now curated, any artifact salvaged from the original church site was protected as a heritage relic, which meant my wind chime wasn't a violation. It was exempt by ordinance. But I didn't tell them that. I let them keep filing violations. I let them send warnings. I let them stack their own evidence like firewood under a dry roof. Because eventually that spark they thought they'd lit under me, it was going to burn upward, fast, and take their whole paper kingdom with it. They called it an emergency executive session. Equation closed doors, board members only, no public comment. The kind of meeting where real decisions get made. I wasn't invited. Naturally, I showed up anyway. They were gathered in the HOA clubhouse, that overly air-conditioned box of vinyl chairs, cheap coffee, and laminated agendas. The walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint and power trips. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose. Let them settle. Let them get comfortable. I wore navy, not black. Navy, soft, professional, forgettable in the way that unnerves people when they realize they should have paid closer attention. As I stepped through the door, the conversation stopped mid-sentence. Trevor's jaw locked. His grip on the gavel tightened like he thought he might need it for something other than posturing. A few of the board members blinked like they weren't sure if I was lost. "Can we help you, ma'am?" someone asked, squinting down the long table. I walked to the head of it, slowly, and placed a single manila folder in front of Trevor. "Before you sell my land," I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn, "read the line about mineral rights." The silence was heavy, unsettling. Trevor opened the folder. Inside, a copy of the 1902 deed, clearly notarized, identifying 600 acres of Winslow land now occupied in full by the Maple Run HOA. Highlighted in red ink were sections 47A through 47D, the expansion zones they'd already begun preparing for sale, and one crucial clause in the lower margin: "The land and all its subsurface rights shall remain solely under the authority of the Winslow lineage unless lawfully subdivided or voluntarily relinquished by the recorded heir." Trevor blinked. This is a historic document." "It's a legal one," I corrected, "and it's been verified by both the state archives and the county recorder's office as of last month, which, as you might already know, is under new oversight." Someone near the end of the table whispered, "Wait, Winslow?" I turned, nodding politely. "Catherine Winslow Avery, widow of James Avery, daughter of Charles Winslow, owner of the Winslow Trust." I let the name sink in like stones dropped into shallow water. Trevor cleared his throat, clearly scrambling. "Even if this is real..." Before he could finish, I slid another document across the table. "Cease and desist." Signed by Judge Marion Clark, a longtime friend, law school colleague, and fellow believer in land sovereignty. It outlined in explicit detail the prohibition of any sale, construction, or development on Winslow-designated property pending judicial review. "You can't..." Trevor started again. "I can," I interrupted. "And I did. And before you try to escalate this further, you might want to read the next document." Out came the third folder. Quiet title action, filed. It named the HOA as a respondent in an ongoing civil claim for illegally occupying private land without valid easement or negotiated leasehold. The room went completely still. "I'm not suing the homeowners," I clarified, calm as a sunset. "Only the HOA, specifically the board responsible for the annexation fraud and the unauthorized usage of historical land. That includes the clubhouse, the recreation fields, the tennis courts, and the parcel labeled Phase 3, which I believe you were planning to sell for a personal bonus." Mr. Maddox Trevor flushed red. "This is ridiculous. We've assessed her $7,400 in violations. She's a non-compliant homeowner." A slow smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "Incorrect on both counts. I'm not a homeowner under your bylaws. I'm a landowner who never signed a covenant. And as it turns out, the land you've been operating on was never legally yours to govern." I turned to the rest of the table. "That $7,400? You find the actual owner of the land you're standing on." A few of them paled. One woman muttered something about needing to call legal counsel. I waited, let it settle. Let them realize that every meeting they'd ever held, every fine they'd ever filed, every playground they'd ever approved, had all taken place without authority. "I don't want blood," I said finally. "I want boundaries. Respect them, and I'll let the rest slide. Push again, and the next round of documents will be subpoenas." Trevor didn't speak. He couldn't. He just sat there, stripped of his smirk, his certainty, his borrowed power, and stared down at the deeds like they were written in a language he'd never learned. The meeting ended without a vote, without a sale, without a gavel bang, just the sound of chairs scooting back, paper being gathered, and one quiet wind chime ringing outside the clubhouse window, a sound they now understood had deeper roots than any of them dared guess. I wrote the letter at my kitchen table long after the last board meeting had dissolved into stunned silence. No lawyers, no PR spin, no grand press release, just me, a cup of black coffee, the original deed laid beside me like a guardian. The truth, when told cleanly, doesn't need embellishment. It just needs to be heard. I wrote it in plain language, the kind my father used when teaching me how to read boundary markers in the woods. The letter began, "Dear neighbors, you've likely never heard my full name. Catherine Winslow Avery. You've waved to me in passing, maybe wondered why I kept to myself. What you may not know is this: the ground beneath your homes, the paths your children ride bikes on, and the clubhouse where you gather, all sit on land held in trust by the Winslow family since 1902. I laid it out simply and clearly. The land had never been legally transferred. The HOA never had jurisdiction. Every fine issued against me was not only baseless, it was issued against the legal landowner. I wasn't seeking damages, I wasn't seeking revenge, just truth and closure. I included copies of the original deed, aerial maps, mineral rights documentation, a notarized letter from the county title office confirming the chain of ownership, and a single sentence that stopped hearts across the development. All past fines issued on Winslow land have been forgiven, with one exception, those filed by or under the directive of Trevor Maddox. I made 600 copies, sealed each in a white envelope with no return address, and just before dawn, I hired Bennett Courier, the same small delivery service that handled church bulletins and wedding invites. The driver, a quiet man in overalls named Lou, asked no questions. By 7 a.m., every doorstep in Maple Run had a letter waiting in the cold light of morning. I stood on my porch with my coffee in hand and watched the sun rise over a sea of white, paper squares dotting stoops like snowdrifts across every cul-de-sac. Silence held for a few hours. Then the ripple. It started as whispers. Then phones buzzed, group chats exploded. Doorbells rang. By noon, 3 neighbors had knocked on my door. The woman from the corner lot brought banana bread. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I'm sorry for the letters, for not asking." Another couple, the Marshalls, stood on my porch with tears in their eyes. "My grandfather went to that church," the husband murmured, pointing to the wind chime. "I didn't know that was part of it." The most surprising visit came from a teenage girl who lived down the street. She handed me a folded note, no words, just a drawing of the old trailhead, with my name written above the trees like a signature. And then came the media. It started local, then regional, then national. HOA built on borrowed land. Widow reveals century-old deed. The woman who owned the whole neighborhood. The wind chime that rang the truth. But I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't need to. The land spoke for itself. And for the first time since I came home, people truly saw me. Not just the woman with the gloves and the herbs, but the daughter of a man who believed land was memory. That roots were worth protecting. That legacy wasn't something you hung on a wall. It was something you defended quietly and completely. Trevor filed his lawsuit on a Tuesday morning, likely expecting headlines by noon. Avery v. Maple Run, HOA, disruption of community governance, intentional interference, defamation, emotional harm. It was, predictably, bloated with legal fluff, the kind meant to rattle people, the kind meant to make you second-guess your silence. But I wasn't rattled. I'd been preparing for this since the day he fined me for a wind chime. I read the filing once, then again. Then I smiled, not cruelly, but quietly. Trevor still didn't understand what he was dealing with. He thought he was fighting a homeowner. He didn't realize he was fighting the county, because 3 weeks before he ever drafted that lawsuit, I made my final move. It came in the form of a forgotten line item in Laurel County's annual tax report, Municipal Utility District Number 14, dissolved in 1997. Its charter abandoned after the last pumping station was privatized. No residents, no assets. But one surviving power clause. Special charter municipalities may exercise limited eminent domain in defense of civic integrity and land use preservation. Using a shell trust in my late husband's legal playbook, I bought the charter, all of it, filed reinstatement paperwork, and became, in full legal standing, a recognized special purpose district. My jurisdiction? Every acre of Winslow trust land. My first act? Issue a private eminent domain order. Seizing the Maple Run HOA office, clubhouse, and auxiliary storage facility under the authority of a municipal claim for illegal occupation and historical easement violation. Trevor tried to sue. I came to court with a charter, 2 title historians, and a notarized chain of land custody going back 120 years. He came with a 3-piece suit and a lawyer who looked like he hadn't read past the headline. The courtroom wasn't grand, just wood paneling and a tired bailiff, but it felt like theater. I sat calm and quiet as Trevor argued a hostile takeover by a rogue resident. The judge, Marion Clark, the same one who'd signed my cease and desist, leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and asked one question. "Mr. Maddox, under which statute does your HOA claim ownership of land it never legally purchased?" Trevor stammered. flipped through papers, cited landscaping easements. Recreational authority. Marion raised one brow. Authority built on what? Occupancy? No answer. My attorney, a woman named Eva Griggs, former federal land rights specialist, stood and presented the Winslow Charter, the municipal charter, the eminent domain action, and a full list of HOA board violations filed under the county's land use abuse audit. She didn't raise her voice once. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the creak of Trevor's chair. When the ruling came, it was clean and cold. All HOA governance powers suspended indefinitely. Clubhouse and administrative property transferred to Municipal District Number 14, under authority of charter owner Catherine Winslow Avery. All HOA fines, fees, and restrictions declared unenforceable. Mr. Maddox is personally liable for civil penalties related to fraudulent property claims and unauthorized governance. Trevor didn't speak, neither did I. He walked out of that courtroom smaller than he'd ever been behind a podium. I stayed seated for a moment, the echo of the gavel still ringing in the air like my wind chime back home. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't knocked on a single door demanding respect. I'd simply walked the lines my father once drew in charcoal and reminded the world they still held. Absolutely. Here is the 700-word resolution section for spring came early that year. The air smelled like honeysuckle and fresh grass, the kind of warmth that doesn't demand anything from you. It just sits beside you like an old friend and says, "You made it." The signs came down first, every last one of them. The Maple Run HOA logo that once hung over the clubhouse, the laminated lawn rules tacked to the oak by the mailboxes, even the ridiculous authorized shrubbery-only plaque in the community garden. Gone. In their place, a single wooden sign carved by hand, "Welcome to Winslow Ridge, founded 1902, reclaimed 2025. I didn't make a big announcement. There wasn't a parade or press conference, just a quiet update to the county map, a legal notice in the Sunday paper, and a change to the property tax codes. Winslow Ridge was now a municipal co-op district. No mandatory dues, no fines, no gatekeeping. We set up a volunteer council, open seats, term limits, and a vote on every initiative. Residents could opt in or opt out, participate how they wanted. Some weren't sure at first. Change, even good change, can feel like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. But when they realized nobody was going to cite them for hanging a porch swing or planting tulips outside the color wheel, things softened. I watched it happen slowly, neighbors talking again, gardens getting wilder, porches getting louder, laughter returning to the cul-de-sacs where once only leaf blowers ruled. The old board members? They moved out one by one, some in shame, some in silence. A few left notes in my mailbox, apologies scribbled on lined paper, folded like surrender flags. I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. The land had already spoken for me. Trevor held on the longest. He tried to act like nothing had changed. Trimmed his hedges too short, marched around the sidewalks like he still owned something. But when the property values adjusted, when the buyer pool dried up after the lawsuit's headlines never quite faded, he listed the house, sold it for $60,000 under market. No goodbye. Just a moving truck at sunrise and silence where his wind-choked flags once snapped in the breeze. And me? I stayed. I turned the front yard into a proper herb garden. Rosemary, sage, lemon thyme. I relayed the old trail my father walked, marked the boundary stones with brass plaques. Kids ride their bikes past now, and sometimes I hear them say, "That's Ms. Winslow's trail." The wind chime still rings, louder than ever somehow. Or maybe it just echoes more clearly now that no one's trying to silence it. Those melted church bell pieces have sung through wars, weddings, funerals, and now through redemption. Some days I sit out back with my hands in the soil, feeling the earth move between my fingers. I plant tomatoes, talk to the cardinals, listen for the sound of my father's voice in the trees. It comes sometimes, not in words, but in peace, the kind that comes only after standing your ground, after honoring something older than fear, after reminding the world that grief does not equal weakness. This was never about revenge. It was about restoration, about memory, about making sure the name Winslow wasn't just a footnote in someone else's development plan. The sun starts to set. Lavender light rolls down over the ridge like a prayer. I dust off my knees, sit back in the old rocking chair, and watch the world I grew from dust return to itself. They thought I was just a grieving widow. Turns out I was the landlord of their entire lives. Ever tangled with an HOA that forgot who really owns the land? Stick around, we're just getting started. Because every small town has secrets, and every quiet porch hides a story like Catherine's. The next name they try to raise might be yours. And trust me, the deed is never where they think it is.